Hey, it's your boy DJ the Dojin Rock and Roller back with a new video. You guys all know that I always cover the hottest anime of the season, and that's why I'm covering one of the hottest series that everyone is talking about. You already know it. It's green, it's mean, it's got memes, punctured spleens, and everything in between, baby. That's right, it's Goblin Slayer. Oh wait. So a few years back, I was hanging with some friends and one of them asked me, "Have you ever read Goblin Slayer?" And I was like, "No, I haven't heard of it." And he proceeded to tell me, "Yeah, these characters are straight up murdered in the first chapter and they show their backstories like right after their deaths. It's not a good series." And this was my first exposure to Goblin Slayer. Since I respected the word of my friend, I made an assumption of what this series is and completely panned it. About a year later, the anime came out and everyone was talking about it, and I completely knew why. It's an explicit series depicting graphic violence and other mature subject matter from the very first episode, but I still held on to my pre-established expectations, so I completely ignored it. It wasn't until months after the season's finale that I thought, perhaps I'm being unreasonable. I haven't actually watched the show nor read the manga nor light novel, and yet I've dismissed it as light novel trash. So I decided that I'll wait for some time, a year as it ended up being, and I'll watch the show for myself. I've cleared up any expectations I had of it and watched it with an open mind, and with fresh, unbiased eyes, I came to the conclusion that this was exactly as I expected. Before I go any further, I should address the elephant in the room, which is the series' first episode. Let's start at the beginning. It opens with this shot with Priestess frozen in fear with this dark film grain overlay, and I actually like this. It sets a dark tone for the series and generates intrigue for those who don't know what's about to happen. It's only ruined by this one line from Priestess that comes out of nowhere after it cuts to black. It breaks the mood and is completely unnecessary. We are then introduced to these totally not expendable characters. Surprise, these characters were totally expendable. And this is how the show becomes controversial, by brutally murdering and victimizing these characters in an explicit manner. Now I totally see what the producers were thinking. Shock the viewers with murder and almost immediately to create controversy, which is just another word for publicity, which in turn becomes viewership. And sadly, this sort of tactic works. People become curious when something becomes talked about and controversial to the extent Goblin Slayer was, but if we were to take this scene as an actual scene of narrative, then we see how it fails. First of all, everyone that dies here aren't characters. They're plot devices whose sole purpose is to set a mood as well as establish that death is a consequence in this world. Except it isn't. 'Cause only 2 other Randys are killed on screen in the entirety of the series. Also, in a world where goblins have massacred entire villages and stole their women to make their babies, you'd think that these guys would be more cautious about a goblin quest as a predominantly female party. Honestly, you'd think that the goblins would be deemed more dangerous with how much the series show what they're capable of doing. And wait a minute, they actually tell us that novice adventurers are commonly killed and kidnapped by these things. Why the hell were these guys so optimistic going against these monsters? It doesn't make any sense. It can make sense in any other generic fantasy where goblins are simply XP farms, but in this world goblins are shown to be a consistent threat to everyday life. The resurrected demon lord ain't got shit on these things. Also, did anyone else notice the terrible music choice in this episode? Just me? Okay then. The music choice in this episode is absolutely abysmal in how inappropriate it is. The notorious death / you know what scene is strangely accompanied by this generic high strings track with an orchestral chorus that would sound more fitting in a fantasy video game, not the dark death scene where we hear the anguished screams of these kids. Then the track ends on a note that makes it sound like they just beat a boss in Dark Souls instead of the grisly defeat that they just faced. And then Goblin Slayer walks in like, dun-dun-dun-dun-dun. Which is fine if you want to introduce a professional wrestler, but it feels highly inappropriate given what happened 30 seconds prior. This girl just witnessed these kids get murdered by a gang of green midgets. We don't want to hear how cool you're supposed to be, Goblin Slayer! Anyway, Goblin Slayer saves Priestess with ease and then proceeds to slay some goblins. They manage to save Fighter, yes, these are their official names, and Goblin Slayer proceeds to kill these goblin babies. Also, they play sad piano music here as if we're supposed to feel bad for these things, and Priestess genuinely becomes horrified of what Goblin Slayer does, but this comes off in bad taste. We just saw what these literal monsters are capable of. We don't need Goblin Slayer to goblin-splain why Goblin bad. So he bashes some baby skulls in, these girls are scarred for life, and we get some cinematic end credits. Also, what a stupid name. Goblin Slayer.
Goblin Slayer.
It's fitting, how his lack of a proper name reflects his complete lack of character, as does literally everyone else, but it still sounds real dumb. His name is his job, for crying out loud. I mean, it could have worked, not knowing his name, I mean. It could have brought some mystery to his character, but again, everyone's name is their job, so it doesn't even work in that light. I'm just saying, if this show was really based on D&D, then you would name your characters in a way to reflect the world and its cultures. It's why D&D handbooks also include lists of names for their races, to give the players a feel of the world's culture. So back on Goblin Slayer. The character, I mean. God, that's confusing. So I'm just gonna call him Slayer from now on. Anyway, the main problem with Slayer as a character, as I said before, is his lack of character. His sole motive to do what he does is his hatred for goblins, and the plot doesn't give any room to build up his character. Aside from his backstory, we know very little about him, and his actions only showcase his simple vendetta. This leads to bland storytelling, since all he does is take up goblin quests and every other prominent character is just along for the ride. This has become quite common in light novels, having a complete blank slate for a protagonist so readers can easily self-insert themselves into the plot. This is a common strategy used in video games, and it makes sense in a game because the player controls the character, but this tactic does not work with traditional narratives. A traditional audience observes the story and its characters with no control over the story, so they have to relate to the characters based solely on the show's presentation. And this results in Slayer and other similar protagonists being an utter failure at catching the audience's sympathy. Also, Slayer just looks like a Dark Souls character. Except, a Dark Souls character goes through trials and tribulations to reach the end goal, while Slayer just beats everything with ease and little consequence. This is best showcased in episode 7, ironically when the show tries to cement consequence into the show. The party is overwhelmed by a goblin horde with a goblin champion, and Slayer is severely wounded. We see Priestess go through some mind break, and she is heavily wounded as well. But despite this, Slayer activates Deus Ex Berserker Rage and uses it to stealth kill this goblin by bashing its skull in against a coffin? Then he proceeds to sneak past these goblins to grab a wig the goblins used for a decoy earlier, and Slayer uses it to strangle the goblin champion. He doesn't even kill the champion, it just retreats after getting its eye gouged out, despite Slayer clearly being in a weakened state. The group initially celebrate their victory quickly before Slayer falls over, succumbing to his wounds. This melancholic track by Millie eases into the scene while Slayer lays there covered in his own blood. If you watched this on Crunchyroll, then you would have gotten this bird's eye shot that lasts over a minute before playing the ED, but in the Japanese airing, they start overlaying the credits before fading to black as the song continues. I honestly don't know why Crunchyroll decided to do this. I actually laughed at their broadcast, and the original edit, while not perfect, is so much better. The credit roll accompanied by this mournful music actually makes the viewer think, did Goblin Slayer die? Then they boot up the next episode to see Slayer waking up next to Naked Priestess. No dramatic build-up or struggle is shown. The episode just opens with him being completely revived. Then the episode proceeds to be a filler episode, to which there are 3 of in this 12-episode series. Also, I love how Sword Maiden attempts to seduce Slayer by sharing her experience of being captured and assaulted by goblins. Like, you go, girl. Yeah, I think I'm actually starting to miss the first episode. So now would probably be a good place to discuss the plot, but it's actually quite unremarkable. To reiterate, the only quota for Goblin Slayer is to slay goblins, thus that's all there is aside from the slice of life filler, which again, takes up a quarter of the series. There's no subplot since the supporting casts are always lacking in character goals, unless spawning Slayer is a character goal, then hey, just gotta copy paste that into the entire female cast and 1, 2, 3 bada bing we got subplot. Okay, so there is one arc in particular that is in complete monotonous trash, and that is the farm battle. This takes up the final 2 episodes of the series where Slayer discovers an imminent goblin attack on Cowgirl's farm. Now this is important since it was always implied that Slayer cared for Cowgirl and the farm is the only home he has. Now we finally see this when Slayer asks for assistance from the other adventurers, willing to give away everything he owns. This is the only moment in the series where we see a glimpse of character in him. This brief moment shows that he actually cares for something aside from goblin genocide, and that he'll risk it all defending it. This is also a good time to mention the English dub. It sounds no different to most other dubs you'd find nowadays, but I want to mention the dub's direction with Slayer's voice. The original Japanese has Slayer's voice strictly stay stoic, and the problem with that is that the performance gets stagnant.
俺の持ち物、俺の裁量で自由になるものだ。俺の装備、財産、能力、時間、そして
Perhaps it's just because I'm foreign to the language, but the voice consistently stays one note and adds little to the character. On the other hand, the English dub adds a bitter tone to Slayer's voice.
They burn and destroy whatever they want. They kill your friends and your family. Then they plunder what's left.
It adds a sense of anger to the character, which is fitting since his only discernible goal is revenge. The performance can still feel static, but the voice work adds more depth to the character, especially in episode 11. Also, since I'm giving praise all of a sudden, I should mention that the action can still be enjoyable to watch. The soundtrack starts to feel much more appropriate as the series becomes more action-oriented, and it does a serviceable job, especially the tracks done by Millie. Their track, Though Our Paths May Diverge, was the main driving force in Slayer's death. You can say all you want about Millie's lyrics being in English, but all of their work is fire. I'm actually glad that they've been given more opportunities to work on anime. Oh wait, what was the saying again? Oh yeah, how Goblin Slayer sucks. It's totally fine to enjoy the show as dark fantasy Goblin Slay in action, but you can't expect me to care for the show when there's 3 episodes of pointless filler. Perhaps it's how fans compare the show's world to Dungeons & Dragons is where my hatred stems, but no matter how I look at it, the show is uneventful and lackluster with characters I can't give a damn about. There's still a few things I can say about this series, mostly about its comparisons with D&D and traditional fantasy, but that would deserve its own separate analysis. Also, the feature film was released not long ago. I didn't watch it, but if you want me to cover it, or make a video analysis on the D&D topic, then make sure you leave a comment